final day of the Translation Summit. I'm honored to introduce you to today's keynote speaker, Ashlee Marie Preston, who will be sharing advice on how we can step up and become advocates of the transgender community.
Welcome to day 3 of the Translation Summit. I'm Ashlee Marie Preston, and I'm your keynote speaker. Many of us have heard the words advocate, ally, accomplice. To some of us, they're new words. To others, they're things that we do. They're ways of showing up for those in our communities who are disproportionately impacted by discrimination. And today, I just want to talk about what it truly means to be an ally, an accomplice, an advocate, however you choose to identify. I think the first thing that we want to recognize is that it's not asking you to recreate the wheel. When we think about trans advocacy and what it means to show up for trans people, I think it's important to dissect the fact that trans identity doesn't exist on a single axis. We have identities that overlap with who we are. And the best way to be an ally or an advocate is to think about intersectionality as an on-ramp into cross-cultural collaboration that yields tangible outcomes. That's a mouthful. So I'm going to break it down first and let you know what intersectionality means. So intersectionality describes multiple threats of discrimination when an individual's identity overlaps with multiple marginalized groups. So as a Black trans woman, for instance, I'm never going to experience one identity on a single axis, but each layer of my identity is going to inform the other. So as a Black trans woman, I can't experience any of those parts of my identity independently, but they all impact me simultaneously, and they inform the experiences that I have in the world. Now, that may sound scary, and believe me, it is, but the reality is that the more communities that my identity overlaps with, the greater opportunity I have to solicit solidarity from each of those communities. So as a Black trans woman, I have an opportunity to connect with the feminist movement. I have an opportunity to connect with the Black movement. I have an opportunity to tap into advocacy within the LGBTQ community and to help others understand what it is that I need from them, not only to survive, but to thrive. And so that leads to my next thought on what it means to reimagine representation. I talked about what intersectional identity is and the importance of being able to not just see our transness, but to see all the aspects of us that make us beautiful and brilliant. And when we think about representation, we usually think about it from a single pillar, and that's visibility. And while visibility is important and it's a beautiful thing, the reality is that visibility only talks about the projection of trans people and not necessarily the protection of trans people. So representation doesn't mean placing us on exhibition all the time, but it also means creating platforms for us not only to be seen, but to be heard. And what we're going to say is always going to sound different because trans people aren't a monolith. And so I think when it comes to representing trans people, the best way to get started is to look around the spaces that you already occupy and pay attention to who's not present and who's not in the room, and think about how you can create an inclusive culture to usher those people into that space. So if it's your faith-based community, if it's your leisure club, your sports team, your social circle, your political, offices in your city or your state, thinking about supporting and uplifting trans leadership, there are so many opportunities to do the work from the place of where you already are. And I think that when we talk about what those spaces look like, it's also important to understand that creating an inclusive culture isn't always going to be easy. We talk about advocacy and allyship looking like sometimes placing your body on the line to keep trans folks safe, but we don't talk about the emotional security that we sometimes have to put on the line when it comes to examining privilege. And the reality is that many of you have known someone who is transphobic, and maybe you didn't just outright tell yourself they were transphobic. Perhaps you made excuses for them. You said to yourself, you know what? They're a really good person. They didn't mean that. They just don't understand. They have a good heart in all of these areas, but when it comes to trans issues, it's just confusing, or it's a lot of information, or the things that we tell ourselves, not solely to make excuses for them, but to give ourselves an out for what it means to truly show up in solidarity, even when we're not in the room. Because it's those conversations and messages that take place when trans people are not in the room that actually help cement the culture that continues to help transphobia thrive. And I think that when we talk about representation, when we talk about allyship and activism and all of those things, sometimes it's just important to just remove the label and just build it into your lifestyle. So instead of being an ally, try to actually practice allyship as a verb. Take an action, and that action can look like anything that you want it to be, because again, this is a lifelong commitment. This isn't only for Trans Day of Remembrance or Trans Visibility Week. This isn't only when a trans person makes history, like Sarah McBride just did recently when she became the first trans person in US history to become a state senator. We have those amazing moments where, of course, trans identity and our lives are going to be front and center in a very specific way. But what does it look like to imagine trans inclusion in a way that doesn't feel so disruptive, that doesn't make it feel like we're an anomaly, that not only welcomes us, but expects us to be in the space? And so, again, for those of you who are looking for the best way to be an ally or a supporter, just remember it looks different for different people, and it requires you to build a relationship with trans people, with individuals, and more importantly, it calls for you to interrogate the ways in which you have been complicit in upholding these systems. And that's not necessarily a demonizing thing. I think when we think about privilege, we automatically, our minds go to, oh, if I said the wrong thing, does this make me a bad person? If I didn't speak up when I knew I should have, does that make me a bad person? I don't think so. I think it can make you an afraid person. And I think that fear is something that we can't control, but we can control how we respond to that fear. And I think the only thing that could cancel out fear is love. And I think that everyone who's watching this is already in a position of not only showing up for the trans community, but also you have enough love in your heart to see the humanity in us and hopefully the courage to be a part of the change that we need to shift the social ecology around how we view trans inclusivity and our safety and our dignity. So there's so much more information coming. We want you to stick around. Please enjoy day 3 of the Translation Summit. We have some amazing panels coming up.
Thanks, Ashlee, for sharing how we can get involved and take action to support and uplift the transgender community. Now, let's join the panelists and moderator for our last day of the Translation Summit. If you're joining us live, please stick around and the next session will begin momentarily. If you're catching up with us after the fact, you can click the link provided for the next session.